welcome everybody, and welcome all of those who are tuning in by virtue of Zoom. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us here. I think there are too many to go by individually and have people say what they are, but feel free to contribute to the conversation and ask any questions that you would like. I think we're equipped so that you can also ask questions. Is that right? Yes, during the question and answer period. So, in any event, Steve Toben is a North Carolina son who grew up and went to a nearby university. And I think it was at the nearby university that I first met Steve, and he distinguished himself in my memory because friends of mine put him in touch with me so that he could serve drinks at the dinners that I had when I got here. And he did such an elegant job in serving the drinks and in accounting for them in wonderful English. And I thought, this is a guy that's going someplace. And he ultimately did go someplace. He went to the Yale Law School and graduated from the Yale Law School. His mother still lives in North Carolina. And he comes and visits her occasionally, time to time. And I think we're piggybacking on a visit to his mother in his visit this time as well. But he then moved to California. He married a wonderful wife there. His wife, Janice, is one of the leaders of the social and emotional learning around the country. Steve has worked at the Hewlett Foundation for a number of years as a chief program officer in one of the fields, and meanwhile also was spending time serving as mayor of Portola Valley, which is a town across the way from Sanford and Palo Alto. And after serving, I want to say 11 years as a program officer, chief program officer at the Hewlett Foundation, the Hewlett family asked him to start, I think he was the first president of the foundation that you're currently running, which is a family foundation, exclusively for members of the Hewlett family. And the idea really was to use that separate foundation, the Flora Family Foundation is the name of it, as a way of introducing and giving some experience to members of the family who would then, if they succeeded in the work that they were doing, the Flora Foundation might be considered for membership on the board of the big Hewlett Foundation. So the Flora Family Foundation is a small foundation compared to the Hewlett Foundation assets, which I think now are somewhere around $13 or $14 billion. But despite the disparity in the size of the foundations, the Flora Family Foundation actually has been engaged in international stuff as well as other kinds of things. Steve can talk about it. But the basic idea was, as far as we know, it's the only example of a family that has decided to try to do this, basically to help equip oncoming generations in the skills of philanthropy, so that if they then move on to the board of one of the largest foundations in the country, in the world for that matter, they will have some experience. And Steve will talk a little bit about how that's all worked out. It is the only one I know of where that's been done. Yet every foundation struggles with how you're going to involve oncoming generations of the family, where we have a lot of family foundations that are dominated by the family. In the case of the Hewlett Foundation, it's not dominated by the family. Their non-family members outnumber the number of family members on the board. The Hewlett and Packard Foundations think slightly different in that there are fewer outsiders, and is much more influenced by the family, the David and Lucille Packard's children. So every foundation struggles with this issue. How do we, in some cases, descendants don't want to join in the philanthropy of their parents. They may want to start their own foundations. But it's all over the map in terms of how they get the experience. And the wonder of this Hewlett example is that it's a well-organized kind of way of doing it. How long has it been in operation?
20 years.
How much?
20 years.
20 years. It's a good period to know. And Steve is going to reflect on the advantages of doing this and the limitations of it and what kinds of situations it particularly works with. So Steve, I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing your experience with it. I can honestly say he's running a unique institution, literally, and he is a unique person as well. And so welcome to your home state of North Carolina. And to the other institution here.
Before we start, I'm having the COVID mask experience of my glasses fogging up whenever I exhale, and I'm wondering if it would be okay with you all if since we have good distancing here, if I might dispense with the mask. I appreciate that. My notes matter to me, and I would like to be able to see them. I first want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank my dear friend Joel for having made this occasion possible. I cherish my relationship with Joel like few others in my life. He introduced me to philanthropy through an introduction to Roger Hines, the former president of the Hewlett Foundation 30 plus years ago. That's why I'm sitting here today. And I am eager to share the story of the Flora Family Foundation in hopes that I can stimulate some discussion on how diverse vehicles for exercising family philanthropy can optimize value and optimize outcomes both for the family and the world. So if I've got this system right, I can advance by shooting my, let's see, it's not advancing, there we go. So we start our story with Bill Hewlett. Bill Hewlett was the co-founder of the Hewlett-Packard Company. In 1966, Bill and his wife Flora established the Hewlett Foundation. And in a short matter of time, the work of the Hewlett Foundation became organized in 5 different areas: education, environment, global population, performing arts, and a special program of work in the Bay Area. Bill always envisioned that the foundation would be staff-driven, highly professionalized, and requiring minimal oversight by the board of directors. He envisioned a board that would be composed largely of highly accomplished individuals from academia, from industry, and public service. He also envisioned that the Hewlett family would have a minimal role in the governance of the Hewlett Foundation. Only 4 out of the 13 seats on the Hewlett Foundation board were to be occupied by members of the Hewlett family. Bill and Flora had 5 children, and for most of the first 3 decades of the foundation's operations, Bill served as chair alongside 3 of his children. So the 4 of them amounted to the family representation on the board. Now, Bill knew that the Hewlett Foundation would be a very attractive target for individuals in Bill's acquaintance who might assume that Bill could open doors for them, the keys to the vault type of deal. He didn't want that. He wanted the Hewlett Foundation to be able to maintain discipline and focus on its established mission. Bill also had a number of personal interests that fell well outside the scope of the programs of the Hewlett Foundation. So Bill decided to establish a very substantial program of personal giving to take care of all that business that he felt was not suitable for attention and energy from the staff of the Hewlett Foundation. The scope of that involvement was quite vast, as you can see here. What you find in Bill's personal giving portfolio are seminaries, universities, think tanks, historically black colleges and universities, conservation organizations, symphonies, public policy organizations. Very little in the way of strategic design evident in Bill's choice of organizations to support. Now, not only was his range of interests vast, but the scale of his giving was very, very substantial. In 1978, the Hewlett Foundation, the big foundation, dispensed $75 million in grants. Bill Hewlett personally made $20 million in gifts. So you can see that this was a non-trivial aspect of the entire philanthropic endeavor on the part of Bill and Bill's associates. But there was a concern, and the concern fell on the shoulders of Bill's eldest son, Walter. Walter was serving on the Hewlett Foundation board at the time. It was also the case that Bill's health was in rapid decline. And Walter was concerned on a couple of different accounts. First, he wondered what would happen after Bill's lifetime to all of those gift relationships that Bill had nurtured over the years. Very substantial sum of commitments. Second, Walter was concerned about whether the siblings, after Bill's lifetime, whether the siblings and the cousins generation would demonstrate the same discipline with regard to separating personal interests from interests of the Hewlett Foundation. So Walter came up with a solution. In September of 1998, he wrote a memorandum to the trustees of the WRH Irrevocable Trust. He was one of the trustees, and the board of the Hewlett Foundation, and he said, I propose to establish a new foundation. The new foundation would be named in honor of his late mother, Flora Hewlett. The logo of the foundation would be the explorer's gentian, which was a wildflower that Flora Hewlett loved and that Flora and Bill used to walk through the Sierra together and spot down on the ground. And Bill was a wonderful amateur botanist and photographer. So this is very meaningful to the family. Walter envisioned 4 goals for the new foundation. The first would be to continue the support for the organizations that Bill had funded in his lifetime. The second would be to give the descendants of Bill and Flora the same opportunities for the joy of giving, if you will, that Bill personally had experienced. The third function would be to deflect away from the Hewlett Foundation requests that would not be appropriate for the Hewlett Foundation to consider under its larger writ. And lastly, Walter envisioned that the new foundation, the Flora Family Foundation, could become a training ground for the next generation of members of the family, the cousins generation, to learn the ropes and, in some cases, eventually be invited to serve as directors of the Hewlett Foundation. So in 1999, the foundation was off and running. The first task was to select a president for the organization. That actually wasn't me. The first president of the organization was this distinguished gentleman standing on the far left of this family photograph. This picture comes from about 2004. But the initial president was a dear friend of the family, Sanford professor, fellow board member at the Hewlett Foundation, Hrant Kachadurian, who was critical to putting in place the principles for operating the Flora Family Foundation. I came into the mix about a year later, and my job was, first and foremost, to listen. It was to listen to the 30-odd members of the Hewlett family, to try to pick out, to discern what was animating their interests in philanthropy, where we might go with that, what might be actionable, and then to provide each of those individuals with the tools that they could deploy in identifying grant candidates, conducting due diligence, figuring out what metrics to apply in the assessment of performance. Effectively, we were training junior program officers. And by doing so, we were greatly leveraging the relatively modest scope and scale of the staff in order to send them out into the world to find organizations that would be subject to staff quality control, but would nevertheless be entirely of their own initiative. Very quickly, we began to populate the grant portfolio with refugee assistance organizations, with organizations funding grassroots women's groups around the world, preservation of important cultural monuments, day worker centers, regional symphonies, music in the schools, public broadcasting. I mean, it was every bit as prolific and profuse as Bill Hewlett's personal philanthropy. So we were really on the mark with that diversification, that diversity of activity. But Hrant Khatchadurian had more in mind for organizing the work of the Flora Family Foundation. He put in place 3 bedrock principles that have been essential to the vitality of the foundation over the years. The first was to instill a vigorous egalitarian spirit in all aspects of the foundation's work. So, every member of the family and every spouse, from the youngest to the oldest, received exactly the same amount of money to spend. Every single member of the family council, including spouses, had the same access to service on the board of directors. When you married into the Hewlett family, in the very next year, you would get an initial term on the board of directors, rotating terms, 2-year terms, a non-family board chair, all of this, and ultimate transparency. At any time, any member of the family council could attend any board meeting, could serve on any committee, had access to every single document in the archives of the foundation. And that in spirit infused the activity of the foundation from day one and all the way up until now. The second key principle that Hrant put in place was that there were to be no boundaries on grant making at all. This, of course, runs utterly contrary to thinking around philanthropy, which is you need to focus. If you're serious about impacting the world, don't have too many buckets. Concentrate your energies in a particular area and define your goals, set your course, and get it done. That was not Hrant's approach. Hrant's approach was to say, whatever interests you, 23-year-old, we're here to validate that, we're here to support you, we're here to let you experiment, try out ideas, risk failure. All of that is fair game. So that's the way we proceeded. The third critical principle came in the form of a metaphor. Hrant's message to the family council was this: imagine that the 30 of you are wandering through a forest, and one of you may find a beautiful bunch of wildflowers that you think deserves protection. Another one of you might see a beautiful rock outcropping that seizes your imagination, and you can figure out some way to activate philanthropic support, metaphorically speaking, around this rock outcropping. 2 of you may discover one another by the side of a bubbling brook, and you'll maybe form a co-sponsored relationship where you'll jointly fund a conservation organization. We're not going to force you to get in lockstep at all at any point early in the history of the foundation. But it could be that a cluster of you will meet up in the forest and decide to form a byway that will enable you all to make common cause and make decisions together, not individually, but jointly. And maybe an even larger number of you will get so inspired by a particular cause that you'll want to form a program. But we're not going to set out immediately to forge those programs and to determine a certain identity for the foundation organized around those big themes. We're going to enable you all to either work with your bunch of flowers or get on the highway and become part of our program team. That was another key principle in the way that the foundation began to be organized. It did not take long for the highway people to find one another. So in 1999, Esther Hewlett, who is the wife of Walter Hewlett, was visiting family in Chicago, and she read an article in the Chicago Tribune defining the ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor around the world. And by this point, we had done some grant making in poverty alleviation, but Esther came back from Chicago and said, could we not organize a more coherent, broad-based program around the gap between rich and poor? And lo and behold, that's just what we did. What resulted from this was a series of country portfolios noted here throughout the developing world in low and middle income countries. The approach we took was to understand that the determinants of poverty are many. And at this point, I was in conference with staff at the Hewlett Foundation, which at that time still has a program on global development. And they were advising me on how best to fund best-in-class organizations working in health, or education, or agriculture, or human rights. We thus began to develop these portfolios around the concept of supporting best-in-class organizations in all of these settings. The most recent of these portfolios is in the Navajo and Hopi country in Arizona and New Mexico. And to illustrate the point, what you find here, for example, Change Labs is an organization that is supporting social entrepreneurs on the reservations who lack certain basic business skills and access to capital. The Naka Inspired Schools Network is advancing a culturally relevant model of education through a charter schools network. Tolani Lake Enterprises is all about food insecurity on the reservation. Each of these organizations has come into the portfolio following extensive due diligence on the staff's part to identify these best-in-class organizations. The key thing here is that what happens in these portfolios is that this is collective action by the portfolio. We salute, we honor individual initiative, but the collective action is an equally important part of the operation. The second highway to emerge in the course of the Foundation's history came during a family vacation circa 2007 when a number of the cousins and their parents were sitting around the table on vacation and said, we need to do something about the climate crisis. And they came back to me and said, we want to do a climate program, help us define the elements for the climate program. I promptly went upstairs to my colleagues at the Hewlett Foundation, where there is one of the largest climate programs in the philanthropy in the country. And I was advised closely by Hewlett Foundation staff that there are excellent opportunities to address the problem of coal combustion as a principal driver of global warming. Superpollutants, such as methane, are grossly underfunded. And you, Flora Family, have great chops to do this internationally. So go out into the world and find good organizations that are working on methane abatement internationally. As a consequence, we identified a group in the Caspian region that has brought about radical reductions in fugitive methane emissions from the nationally owned oil and gas companies. We just handed off that grant last year to a $1 billion foundation in London, so that's been a nice story for us. The third area that we identified for our climate work as a family was in mobilizing constituencies, getting support to the Greta Thunbergs of the world, getting support to young people in Seoul, Korea who want their government to stop funding overseas coal plants, getting funds to indigenous peoples in the Amazon who are fending off the predations of fossil fuel companies. This element is not appealing to the Hewlett Foundation, but it is very appealing to the cousins and the members of our family council, so we include that. Lastly, we have an element around promising initiatives, and an example of this is an organization called Energy Peace Partners, which we have funded since its beginning. We were the first foundation funder of this organization. This organization is addressing the problem that the United Nations system depends exclusively on diesel fuel to provide energy for refugee camps, for humanitarian assistance operations around the world. This is not a good thing. By converting to solar, you get public health benefits, you get environmental benefits, you train up residents of refugee camps in good occupations that they can carry back to their home settings. This organization today has now grown fivefold since our first grant 4 years ago, and is well on its way to becoming a major player in the UN system. Now, in addition to the program areas, the highways, we have a few compelling byways as well. These byways require initiative on the part of 5 family members who come together and have to articulate a careful problem statement, a theory of action, identify a roster of candidates, and identify evaluation metrics. That proposal is submitted to our board of directors. If the board approves it and they themselves will commit some portion of their personal allocations to the initiative, they can go off and do their own clustered activity. The first of these, now about 7 years old, is in marine conservation. The theory of action here is that if we can identify compelling local initiatives with potentially significant global scale possibility, that's where we should put our money. So one of the early bets we made was on mangroves. Mangrove forests are one of the most important ecosystems in the world. They provide a buffer from flood surges along coastal areas. They provide critical habitat for nurseries. They provide sources of livelihood for coastal residents. It also happens that they sequester a lot of carbon. But we didn't know that 7 years ago until the Flora Family Foundation provided support to Conservation International for a project in Costa Rica to investigate the carbon sequestration capability of mangroves. As a result of that grant and subsequent grants, we have learned that mangroves sequester 10 times the amount of carbon that comparable terrestrial forests sequester. And as a result of that early support, the idea of blue carbon strategies has become integral to global scale responses to climate change. So we're very proud of the role that we played in helping build the case for mangroves. Anyway, one more byway that has come about just in the last couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, began with a cry for help that I sent out a year ago in the wake of the latest great reckoning that we as a society have faced with respect to racial injustice. And I said to our family council, what can we possibly do as a small foundation? And one cousin put her hand up and said, I know what we can do. We can establish an initiative in black maternal health. It happens that in the United States is the only industrialized country in the world where maternal mortality is on the rise, for one thing. And black women experience a maternal mortality rate 4 times greater than white women. And there is no explanation for this socioeconomic in nature. So we have an opportunity here. We have identified advocates. We have a theory of action. We believe, the capability to assist in significant ways. With a commitment of just $550,000, we will become the 3rd largest funder in the realm of black maternal health in California. And we're very, very excited. There are metrics that we can attach to this. It is a concrete response that we think is properly calibrated to the work we do and the size that we are. So we're off and running with this, and when Joel invites me back 2 years from now, I'll have a wonderful report to share on how it's been going.
Invitation extended.
All right, let me quickly move through some data points about the foundation, just to give you a little bit more of the texture of the foundation. This table is intended to illustrate, again, the diversity of areas in which the foundation works. It also illustrates some of the dynamism that has been evident over the last many years. This compares the 2020 percentage of dollars out the door against historic dollars out the door. So for example, you can see that the environment area is very prominent in the mix here. And again, the climate crisis has been a great spur to our work in the environment. Also notable here is that the relief and emergency assistance, unfortunately, has compelled us to more and more of an allocation. In 2020, this had largely to do with our COVID response and our response as good Westerners to helping our fellow neighbors who were burned out by the devastating wildfires in our part of the country. Other dimensions to how we work. This is intended to convey the sense that we're quite ecumenical in our approach to funding organizations of all sizes, but we do love hanging out with startups. And so 25 of our grants in 2020 went to organizations of under $500,000 a year. And not every angel investment is a big winner, but we have had our fair share of great hits, where after a period of some years, as I mentioned with Energy Peace Partners, we find organizations are now in the multi-million-dollar level and doing really important work. Other data points here. We often hear that foundations should do more general support. The average across the sector is about 25%. For us, it's 62%. In addition, when we work with a large organization, say a Conservation International, and we work with one of their programs rather than general support, it's always flexible program support. And even when we're doing project-specific support, the little purple slice up there, we always allocate a 20% share to general operations, which we think is a reasonable stake in terms of respecting their needs for flexibility. This slide is intended to underscore the point that we give equal value to the initiative of the individuals in our family council who are incredibly inspiring people, who take this very seriously, who do a better job at due diligence than I do, oftentimes, out in the world. At the same time, we celebrate the importance of marshaling the collective intelligence of the Family Council through our programmatic domains. More typically, what you find is a pie that will have a whole lot of collective stuff in a tiny slice of individual, which is sort of on the side, what's it called? Discretionary grant. I hate that term. I don't like it. We believe that every grant that goes out the door is subject to careful scrutiny. I review them all. There is quality control. We celebrate the autonomy, but we also recognize that we have an earnest duty to do right by these dollars and not to make frivolous grants. And then just to drive home the point, this is again a depiction of the allocation of our overall grants budget between individually sponsored or co-sponsored grants and our collective pursuits. So let's go back to the original purpose of the foundation. We're no longer sustaining Bill Hewlett's personal philanthropy. It's been 20 years. I'm sure Bill wouldn't mind that we've sunset those relationships after all this time. We've done a pretty good job of providing a vibrant philanthropic vehicle for the descendants of Bill and Flora. Larry Kramer, the president of the Hewlett Foundation, tells me that he's very grateful that the Flora Family Foundation has taken pressure off the Hewlett Foundation by directing the grants of the family through the Flora Family Foundation. And then, so far as the training function is concerned, I interviewed all 4 of the cousins who are currently serving on the Hewlett Foundation board to get their observations of what value, if any, the Flora Family Foundation had in their preparation, in their formation as future trustees of the Hewlett Foundation. The first and most obvious comment that came through was that they know the basics. They walk in the Hewlett boardroom for the first time. They know what it means to identify grants. They know what strategy is all about. They're very conversant in the vocabulary of grant making. All good. So that orientation to basics is really essential. They also commented that there's a certain asymmetry that is unavoidable in the boardroom. Most of their colleagues on the Hewlett Foundation board are significantly older than they and have much longer resumes than they have. But because they have been involved with the Flora Family Foundation, they've been in the field on side trips, they have long experience of conversation around philanthropy, which many of the non-family trustees do not have. There's an equalizing energy to that. They've been able to have a kind of leveling function through their experience of the Flora Family Foundation. A third observation. One cousin remarked to me that the Flora Family Foundation has been a vessel through which the family could crystallize its own values in philanthropy. For example, the value that we will respect one another's initiative and activities in philanthropy. We may not always be equally enthusiastic about every other person's grant, but we understand that there is license given for each person to pursue their own approach. The cousins carry that value into the Hewlett boardroom and thus enact the virtue of deference to fellow board members, the virtue of deference to staff. One Hewlett Foundation board member, Rakesh Rajani, I think I mentioned it before, remarked to me that in his experience with large foundations, it can happen that the next generation will come in after the founder is gone and say, don't forget, we're the children of the founder. We're the heirs to the founder's legacy. We're going to assert a prerogative here. We're going to demonstrate power that comes by way of our bloodline. That does not exist with the Hewlett family. That's partly their DNA, but it's partly because in the context of an egalitarian system of power sharing with the Flora Family Foundation, they have cultivated habits of sharing and cultivated these habits of mutual respect that don't intrude into the dynamic of the Hewlett Foundation and the boardroom. So the cousins never think, what would Grandpa do? They have their own ideas, partly that have come from their experience together, working together in the context of the Flora Family Foundation. The other point I found interesting is that the cousins say, look, we've learned a lot at the Flora Family Foundation, and it gives us the authority to say that what the Hewlett Foundation does is not always sacrosanct. The Hewlett Foundation has a very powerful way of doing business, and sometimes you think that Larry Kramer says nothing wrong ever, but Larry would say, oh yeah, I do, and I need to be challenged on that. And the cousins feel that because of their experience of the Flora Foundation, they're capable of making that kind of differentiating observation about the way philanthropy should be done. One of the cousins, Billy Hewlett, very thoughtful man, remarked to me that when he was in his 20s and the Flora Foundation was just getting off the ground, he had his head down getting his PhD in computer science, and he was focused on his career. And he really had no bandwidth for thinking about the larger world. But then he went on the Flora Family Foundation board, and it opened his eyes to a whole different constellation of issues. And then he went on a site trip to Uganda with us, and his eyes were widened even more about not only the potentiality, but the obligation that he had as Bill Hewlett's grandson. He said to me that he would never have elected to go on the Hewlett Foundation board but for his experience with the Flora Family Foundation, which I think is a powerful testament to this little vehicle. I mean, and again, the Flora Family Foundation is 100 times smaller than the Hewlett Foundation. So forgive me if I sound like I'm overplaying. I don't mean to. But the fact that that vehicle has been so instrumental in the formation of these now trustees of the Hewlett Foundation, I think is significant. Lastly, Larry Kramer, again, he says that the family plays a very important role in providing ballast on the Hewlett Foundation board, even again, though they're younger and less experienced than many of the senior board members. But Larry does value very much the fact that when you have Eric Gimel sitting in the room as Bill Hewlett's eldest grandson, you can't help but remember that Grandpa is the reason why this foundation exists, and we should not lose sight of the best in the Hewlett family tradition. Now let me conclude a few concluding remarks. We decided that this statement of purpose needed a little updating a couple of years ago, and so we came up with a restatement of purpose. We thought we needed to emphasize, unlike the first version, that at the end of the day, we shouldn't be doing this work unless we're committed to making meaningful change happen in the world. And so this is first and foremost our reason for being. And we never lose sight of the obligation we have to steward these resources in the best possible way. The second restated purpose concerns the role that the foundation has played and continues to play in enabling individuals in the Hewlett family to pursue their own interests, to engage with the important issues of our time. And what we have seen is that in several instances, the experience of the Flora Family Foundation has been important in informing career decisions that have led the cousins in some very important directions professionally. I could catalog for you a host of really remarkable stories from the Hewlett cousins on where they have gone in their careers, in part, not exclusively, but in part because of their exposure to this work. We are unapologetic about the value that the Flora Family Foundation has with respect to building ties across the family. Why? It's not just that it's nice to have a good experience in Bangladesh with your aunt. It's that when we marshal the collective intelligence of these very capable and fortunate individuals, we get a better product at the end of the day. When we manage those conversations well, our collective grant making is all the better for it. And then lastly, we're pretty much done with the cousin generation, but we've got a new crowd lining up. We've got fourth generation folks. They range in age from almost 19 down to 3 months old. And I believe that it's critically important for us not to lose sight of the value that we can offer the next generation, hopefully in a fashion that will make them as excited as the cousins generation when it comes to the work with the foundation. So, a few concluding remarks. Here's the family, a picture taken a couple years ago, a little rowdier depiction than the 2004 version because the kids are on the move here, and we love that. There are some 90,000 private foundations in the United States. Most of them are not like the Gates Foundation or the Hewlett Foundation or the Ford Foundation. Most of them are animated by the interests of families. About every 2 months or so, I learn, to my amazement, that there's a new billion-dollar foundation coming online. This vast intergenerational transfer of wealth that we've been hearing about for years is well underway. Most founders of foundations imagine that their descendants will have some role. But it's a lot to ask of a 30-something to step into a billion-dollar foundation and start immediately dispensing million-dollar grants. Far better to have a side vehicle that enables, at relatively low risk and low cost, an avenue for experimentation, trial balloons, failure. That's what we're about. Two of the leading commentators in the family philanthropy sector, Wendy Ulasek and Kellen Gersig, are in the middle of a very interesting research project focused on donor families, sizable donor families. And the basic dynamic the tension that they're examining is whether a large donor family should integrate the energies of the family in a single primary vehicle, like the Hewlett Foundation, or whether the family should be essentially allowed to disperse and differentiate through donor-advised funds, through family-advised corporate giving programs, through individual giving programs, through side foundations, through individual giving programs. We have tacked to the middle on that question. We believe that we are well aligned with the Hewlett Foundation. We're not the same by any stretch, but they have a climate program. We have a climate program. They have effectively an international development program. We have an international. They do a lot of general support. We do a lot of general support. So there's abundant resonance, and we're providing a pipeline for the cousins eventually to move into the Hewlett Foundation. Very harmonious. So at the end of the day, I like to think of, you can't see it. What that says up at the top below the menu bar is Hewlett and Flora. We take our cue from the ancient Greeks. We regard the Hewlett Foundation as the Apollonian side of the Hewlett philanthropic endeavor. And we regard the Flora Family Foundation as the Dionysian side. Of course, Dionysus was the god of wine and dance, so I know which god Joel would vote for. But, it's spontaneity, it's experimentation versus reason, discipline, order. It takes both to make a complete and wholesome enterprise. So that's my case for the virtue of dual foundations, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Steve. Really. The floor is now open for questions, comments. Anybody present?
What is the age that you get home to start participating? I mean,
18.
18.
The practice is that incoming 18-year-olds are obliged to participate in an orientation that I lead. We used to call it boot camp, but some cousins thought that was a little too brutal. And I'm a really nice guy. But 18, and at 18, that individual also is eligible for an initial year term on the board, and is eligible for a 1/3 allocation of funds. And in this way, we start drawing them in.
Steve?
Hey, John.
Yeah. Well, what mechanisms do you have in place for conflict resolution? I mean, I would imagine, for example, going back to your gentian in the forest example, that some members of the family might think that preserving this wonderful stand of flowers is the most important thing, and somebody else might think that building a pathway that disabled people might be able to use, going right through the most optimal place where the flowers are. And I assume that, I mean, obviously that's a bit of a ridiculous hypothetical, but the idea is there. I think there must be conflict that somebody needs to mediate, and how does that work at the Flora Family Foundation?
You know, I could imagine a different context in which friction over choices and priorities would present itself. That has not been the case. This is a very high-functioning family. Let me be the first to acknowledge that I've been extraordinarily fortunate to work with 30-plus individuals who share a fundamental ethic of respect for one another across the branches and across the generations. Again, there will be instances where I can tell in the boardroom that a particular grant is not winning great enthusiasm from a director. But the ethos we've cultivated is that, look, each individual has an allocation of funds within certain broad parameters, and I could comment on the broad parameters. Within certain broad parameters, we're going to defer to that individual. You have your allocation, you do what you wish with it, subject to the review mechanisms that we have in place. But through that means, we've largely headed off any serious disagreement over how the foundation should prioritize its work. In our collective areas, I pay very careful attention to what I'm hearing from the family members on, well, which element of the climate program should we emphasize this year? And it's varied. There are some who are, less than enthusiastic about the fact that we're funding activists in the street. But given, again, this long history of deferring to the interests, the collective interests of the majority, we have been able to execute. And again, there's a lot of fluidity, too. Thus, we're not rigid in how we perform or how we allocate dollars such that there is room for flexibility as well.
There's Esther Hewlett.
I'm glad Esther Hewlett is here. I believe there may be other members of our family council who are attending.
Keep an eye on it.
So, any further questions from Zoom or inside?
We have a question on Zoom.
Oh, sorry.
Chat. While they're getting that Zoom question, maybe I can just ask you briefly. Clearly, there has to have been some mechanism that conflict has occurred, and without, respecting everybody's privacy and all that sort of stuff, I'm interested to hear in the staff's role in trying to mediate that conflict. Because clearly, you seem like there's a diplomacy component to your job. I'd like to get a little insight on how you go about doing that work.
I'm not sure if the Zoomers could hear the question. The question goes to the mediation function in a context like this one, and how do we adjust for differences? So I wanted to be a mediator when I grew up. I went to law school Actually, I was already grown up when I started wanting to be a mediator. I went to law school. I began my career as a practicing litigator and quickly became disenthralled with the nature of the system, the waste, the damaged relationship. So I said, I want to get trained to be a mediator, and that's what eventually I hope to be doing. That didn't work out. Instead, I was hired to manage the program on conflict resolution at the Hewlett Foundation. But I carried those skills with me into this job. It's been a function that I've performed, to be sure, and I think it's an important function. But these guys have made it easy on me. We have had instances where, in one case, a family member was concerned about what he regarded as a trend toward more politicized grant making. And the solution we came up with in conversation was to help the proponents of such grants define their interests, define their goals precisely, and determine whether a different tactic could be articulated, a tactic that would be captured in a different grantee than the one that the proponent had originally advanced. But the objective would be advanced at the end of the day. We would find a way to do something about coal financing that would be acceptable and wouldn't involve the more politicized aspects of the work. And again, through that mechanism, through that dialogue, we have really done I think a fruitful job of adjusting for differences. And a lot of these conversations are off camera. We don't have big negotiation tables where we meet these things out. There's a lot of shuttle diplomacy, but again, I don't want to overstate that because it's been a very positive family system in which to be involved.
Other questions here? Yes, Joel.
This is very exciting what you're doing. We're in education, so we know this very well. But I'd like to know success rates. You talked about 30 people who are family members. You talked about 30 people that are family members. What percentage of those have nothing to do with you? What percentage of those had something to do with you and then go to success? And what percent, which I hope happens a lot, do they go and then do something else which they still learn from? So talk about what the numbers look like.
I would say, back of the envelope, that maybe a third of our family council members dutifully apply their allocations to solid grants, oftentimes renewal grants. This is not their number one priority in their lives. So the mind share I get from them on an annual basis is minimal. Another third are sincerely interested in especially the collective work of the foundation. And while they may not be calling me every other month to find out what's new, they'll show up when we have our grant deliberations. And they'll take an active role. They'll read the docket. They will take a serious interest. They'll sometimes circulate articles that are relevant to the package. And then the last third are our super active people. Those who are really as good at what they do as program officers I have known in my life, such as Flora Hewlett Birdzell, who was the author of the Black Maternal Health Initiative. It went through multiple drafts. It's heavily footnoted. She advanced several pilot grants before we came forward with a serious plan for the initiative. So that's the breakdown. And I think there was a question, I didn't quite follow the question around success. What you meant by that?
Out of the 30, well, how many are still, do they drop off? I mean, there's...
Okay, no.
No,
they don't drop off. Again,
all 30 who are 18 and over are your group, right?
All 30 are active, but again, they do have the ability to opt out of participation in a given year.
Right.
And on average, 1 or 2 per year will say, I'm not going to be able to do this. I just had twin babies. I'm not going to be able to do it. That's fine. We make the cost of participation modest, but even if a person only gives us 1% mind share in a given year, we celebrate the output of the individual. And another vehicle through which we do that is by asking them to write sponsor statements for their grants of a certain level. And so the family gets to hear their voice and why it is that they care about a particular organization. And even if it's only 5 grants a year, the family as a whole hears what they're doing, and it enriches the mix. Thank you.
We had a question from Judd Kessler on Zoom. Mr. Kessler, would you like to unmute yourself?
Judd, you're on.
Sure, thank you. Actually, as usually happens, you ask a question, and by the time they get to you, it's been partially answered. The question was, we all know that looking around this country and watching a lot of intelligent people say some very, very silly things, that there are people in an intelligent group that will come up with some proposed project that's unworthy or somehow inappropriate. How do you handle them? I've heard already that you've steered them by a certain amount of guidance and so forth. But suppose you get, well, have you ever had a real strong-headed, I want to do this person?
We have had, on rare occasions, we have had, I've been approached by family members who have an idea for a grant that I think is beyond the pale of what the family council and the board would endorse. And thus, again, in a quiet way, I have been able to suggest that here's the interest you have, why don't you try this route rather than the bomb throwing route, something like that. It's very rare. And in a couple of those instances, it came about largely through personal acquaintances and friendships. This is all part and parcel of sometimes how families operate. You know, sometimes their gift decisions come simply as a result of what their college roommate tells them they should do, not a strategic process of figuring out what the best play should be. And again, the socialization that takes place over time as people come to understand the culture of the foundation, it, I think, deters them. They get a sense of what really falls within the broad boundaries, and the boundaries are very generous, and what would really be inappropriate for the foundation, in which case they can write their own check if they wish.
Joel, Esther Hewlett wanted to ask.
Oh, yeah. Ms. Hewlett? Ms. Hewlett, you're on.
Go ahead, Ms. Hewlett.
Thank you. Yes, I have just a comment to make. I'm Esther Hewlett. I'm a member of the Flora Family Foundation, and we've been very blessed to have Steve leading our foundation for these many years. My comment is that good leadership is so important, so essential to the success of a foundation like ours and to a family like ours, which was trying to encourage the spirit of philanthropy among the broader family. And I think you can all see from Steve's excellent presentation today that he is just exhibit A of this. So my hope for everybody is that you could find a leader as good as Steve has been for us. He is just absolutely amazing. Thank you, Steve, and I wish for all of you that you could find somebody like Steve to lead your foundations.
Thank you, Esther. It's very kind of you.
We have a question from Debbie Bussell.
Oh, Debbie?
Well, thank you for this
Speak up, Debbie. We can't hear you.
interesting presentation that is resonating very much with me.
Can you please speak up?
There you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a head cold, so I'm sorry about my voice. I'm representing a family foundation where there's a big struggle between the hated word of discretionary funding and core collaborative funding. Much smaller than even the Flora Family Foundation, never mind having a Hewlett Foundation to serve as the training ground for. And so I'm curious about this approach. It's very interesting where you have half of your grant making essentially allowing for this autonomy among the family members, the other half more the collective programs that you mentioned. If this model works for smaller foundations and would it work? I guess the question is, would the Flora Family Foundation work without the Hewlett Foundation existing?
I think it's a terrific question. Would the Flora Family Foundation model work in the absence of the Hewlett Foundation? The Flora Family Foundation, I think, would have, again, it's a tough counterfactual to imagine, but if we had not had a Hewlett Foundation looking over our shoulder like the gracious big sister, I think there would have been much more pressure on the foundation to take the strategic philanthropy approach, where the responsibility to really be clear about what you're trying to accomplish is foremost. And it goes back to Apollo and Dionysus, right? Because the Hewlett Foundation is so disciplined and so well organized, there has been a certain license, I think, that the Flora Family Foundation can take that has been empowering for members of the family. But having said that, I think there is value. I mean, if you're just starting out from day one, the idea that we are going to establish a foundation, kids, and mom and dad are not going to predetermine the program areas or predetermine the strategic goals. Rather, we're going to have a generous period of exploration, which may or may result in some programs that Mom and I approve of or support. But the critical feature is the power distribution piece and ensuring that all the stakeholders have some sense of ownership, even if it results in some diffusion of impact. The value of engagement for us has been practically paramount. And I will be frank in admitting that there are times when I'm aware that we may be sacrificing the highest and best use of a dollar in service to the value of engagement. But I think at the end of the day, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Other question, this last comment, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This last comment reminds me that I've had a number of conversations with individuals, with families, who say they have their own foundation that the parents started, and often the children don't want to be part of it. And what I'm sensing from your conversation is that, but you've got an overriding Hewlett family ethic there, which puts a primary factor on collaboration, cooperation, coming together. I was on the board of one family foundation, which was where the relations among the three branches of the family was so bad that we had to terminate the foundation, basically. And we did. It was a two-structure foundation, membership of foundation and trustees of the foundation. And I was one of the members of the family, and we all agreed there was no way it was going to work. There wasn't any cohesion. Yeah. What you have with a overrushing family, like the Hewlett family, with the ethics that are there, which is why it seems to me that may be an important ingredient in being able to do things the way you talked about doing it. I just wonder if that's right.
That's exactly right. It's hard for me to imagine a scenario where I'm confronted with rancor, because it's never existed with this family. But in part, I think they have been so well served by their long history of service through the Hewlett Foundation. One of the cousins said to me, when we get together as a family to discuss foundation business, the conversation is elevated. We don't talk about unimportant things. the better angels of our nature are summoned forth. And we get to see each other in our best light. And furthermore, that this long legacy of Hewlett philanthropy, I do think has imbued the family with a sense of service. As I mentioned, not every cousin is going to want to serve on the board of the Hewlett Foundation, and that's fine. Enough of them have been sufficiently trained and are prepared to give the time that we have a strong cadre of members of the family who are in the mix there. But another point, at the very front end, Joel, there were some of the cousins who said, this is too much money for me to be involved with. I'm 16 years old. My friends' parents don't make as much as you're telling me I can give away. I'm not down with that. So it was only through the gentle process of introducing them to at a basic level. So do a $10,000 grant. That's all you need to worry about. And we'll make the transaction costs very low for you. And see how you feel about it. And see how you feel about watching your sister do a $25,000 grant. And we'll inculcate that practice over time. And it has warmed them all. I mean, nobody is alienated from the Hewlett Foundation. But I think that process, that socialization over time has been critically important.
Let me turn the question around. You've talked about the way the Flora Foundation Foundation is better because it had Hewlett, but how is Hewlett better because of Flora? That is, one way it could be, you talked about Hewlett being disciplined. Now, discipline to me stands for rigid, and we have rules, and damn it, we continue to do what we were doing in the past, damn it. So in some sense, having that, they say, well, if you want to do that, go down to Flora. Or we'll talk to the people at Florida. They tried that screwy idea, and it didn't work. Now, do you see that?
In all honesty, I don't. And it's just because, one of the cousins said, Steve, they're really two different institutions. They're completely different cultures. They're operating in an utterly different orbit. And I get that. Again, Larry Kramer is generous in acknowledging that he hasn't had to worry so much about orienting these young people to the practices of the boardroom. They come in as experienced, smart people. And that's a plus. Anytime a president of an institution doesn't have to worry about managing his board members or her board members, that's a bonus. Because a lot happens in the boardrooms. So there's that. And then again, the value of Flora to Hewlett insofar as kind of providing real people who embody the present edition of the Hewlett family values. I think that's a real plus. Larry also said, I don't know if that's going to continue over time. As the family, as the fourth generation now comes on, maybe they will have too little connection to their great-grandfather for it to make any positive difference at all, and he could be right. But at the end of the day, I do think our little ship has provided positive energy to the Hewlett Foundation. Question here.
So we spend a lot of time in philanthropy talking about succession on the board and who comes in, and clearly that happens in your organization. I'm curious about succession on the staff level. Miss Hewlett said some very nice things about you, and you clearly played a role for this family that's intimate, that's unique, and not wishing you anything but continued success in that. At some point, everybody leaves their job, and I'm curious to know if there has been any discussion ever about that, or how you go about finding somebody to do the extraordinarily unique thing you do for this family.
Well, as a matter of fact, I will be leaving my position next July 1 after 18 years on the job, and we have identified the next president of the Hewlett Foundation. That announcement will be made in coming weeks. So we have gone through the process. It's gone very smoothly and very productively. The family members have been intensively engaged in the search process. It's been a 3-year process, as a matter of fact. It's a long runway, but we felt it was that important to get it right. The time required to write the position profile was extensive because of all these different weird dimensions to the work that I do. We only have essentially 2.1 full-time equivalents as staff. We're able to operate, it's very lean for a foundation with this level of output, but we're able to do it in sizable part because the family is so willing to take on some of the labor and make it work. Continuity matters, seniority matters for sure. I'm better at this job today, absolutely, than I was 15 years ago, and I'm glad it took Joel 15 years to invite me to come. So.
Well, and you can check, Larry Kramer is going to be speaking here in 2 months, and so you can check out everything with him. He said, wait, I promised.
I have a quick question. Yes.
She has a microphone over there.
Oh, who has a microphone? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you for being here today. I wanted to shift a little bit the question on the type of funds that you provide to other organizations. I read on your website that it's mostly local organizations in their own countries. I was wondering if this make any difference on the engagement of the family, or if this is also something aligned with the Hewlett Foundation.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I spoke before about some of the defining values of the Hewlett family philanthropy. And one defining value, it comes by way of a wonderful quote from one of the late members of our family, Jean-Paul Gimont, who said, "You should put the water where the roots are." And when we go into the field and we experience the extraordinary talent and resourcefulness of people who have nothing with which to solve their problems, but solve them anyway, that is enormously powerful. So from the very early days of the Flora Family Foundation, support to groups such as the Global Fund for Women, such as the Global Fund for Children. I think these were foundational grants in our very first year, and we've maintained those relationships continuously over time. So that bias toward local initiative, ground level initiative, which is in some contrast to the Hewlett Foundation, which tends to operate more in the world of elites and think tanks and so forth. But again, nice complementarity there. So I would absolutely include that value among the kind of the core principles that define what the foundation is all about.
Great presentation. Look forward to hearing more about the maternal mortality work
Yeah.
that you all are doing. But my question is related to the orientation that you have when you bring people on. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Maybe what the 2 or 3 most important things you hope they learn in that onboarding.
So the orientation consists of a series of tutorials that in the COVID period, we were only able to do this through Zoom. So I would assign our young rising family council member readings, including the Breast Harvey book, which I'm sure you all know. Money Well Spent. Money Well Spent, which is as good a grounding as you can get in the principles of strategic philanthropy. But Alexander was also assigned readings from our dockets. I said, tell me what's wrong with this package of grants. Would we have been better off defining a single objective for this entire portfolio rather than distributing these dollars among 8 best-in-class groups doing wildly different things? And to provoke him into thinking about the assumptions under which we operate. He would write an essay every week for me, tutorial style, which I would then go through with him. And my aim was to, number one, make him excited about participating, because it's a little intimidating. And 18-year-olds have other things on their minds. He's a freshman at Sanford, and he's got his hands full. So get him excited. Let him know that his intelligent mind is just as valuable as his uncle with a PhD in theoretical physics. That perspective will enrich the mix, just as the perspective of a new spouse is so indispensable to refreshing the energy of the foundation. That's his job. So those two aspects, I think, are most foremost in my mind when I do these orientations.
Yes, now, he's going to, microphone coming.
Thank you.
And then if there are questions from the Zoom gallery, please put your hand up. And I'll call them.
I just have a question. I still can't get my head around the amount. I saw that it was close to $4 million that was distributed in 2020. How does that get renewed every year? Was it set up? Was there an endowment for the
Yes.
Flora? And how big is it? And
Yep.
then that determines the $4 million that gets
Sure.
distributed every year. Is that 20% of the principal, or is that, or 5% or 15%?
Yeah. So the current endowment is about $130 million. That compares to the endowment of the Hewlett Foundation at $14.2 billion. So our payout in I'm not dealing with 2021 numbers. So a year ago, the endowment was much less. So the payout was about 5% of the value of the endowment.
Comments or questions from Zoom? Anybody? Comments from the room? I think we've got 3 more minutes.
Joel, I had one question that came through chat,
Where?
if I can find it. Let's see.
I'm getting only part of the question. What advice, if any, do you give parents of the 4G members of the family, I think? But I didn't quite catch it all. Can you get it back up, Erica?
Pardon me?
I didn't get to see the entire question in the chat, but I only saw a fragment of it.
I am able to ask this one question. It says, in such a large family, did you find some whose philanthropic objectives in the Flora Foundation seemed either unworthy or not serious? Were there some? How did you deal with them?
Never a problem with unserious interests. Family members, I think, understand the value of stewarding these dollars. It may well be that for a particular member of the family, advancing the cause of novels in English translation from abroad is a very important cause to pursue. Others may find that to be less salient to the pressing issues of our time. But again, the ethos of the Family Council is that we will respect the decisions that others make, even though the issues they choose to fund don't rise to the top in my scale of thinking about things. What we do find is that there is enough enthusiasm around the collective pursuits, primarily in climate and in our GAP program and in our 2 initiatives, that there's ample energy there that seems to assign sufficient priority to those most important areas. So I'll stop there.
Well, we have time for one more. We've got 1 minute.
Thank you. So just to bring it home, you spoke briefly about the success of a lot of the programs and initiatives that the Flora Foundation is funding, but I noticed in your chart that I think re-granting made up for about 9% of the monies that are spent. Can you talk briefly about the grant-making process and whether they are multi-year grants that don't require re-granting, or is it just the term in which the family members serve on the foundation? What is that?
Yeah. So two pieces to your question as I hear it. For one, regranting consists of support to intermediary organizations that are then going to distribute in smaller pieces of the pie. So an example is Global Green Grants, which works with activist organizations all around the world that are working largely in indigenous communities, where we can't get to those organizations very readily. So they can do a better job of placing those dollars than we can. With respect to multi-year, that's a critically important piece. We aspire to a multi-year rate of at least 30 to 40%. Last year we fell far short because of COVID. We did a lot of one-year emergency grants. But we're vigorous believers in the importance of multi-year support, flexible support, and a presumption of renewal of grants. So our rate of renewal is around 65% or 2/3 on a year-over-year basis. And we think that's a relatively healthy stance to take with respect to our grantees.
Thank you for that.
I thank all of you for coming this afternoon and evening, and all of you for joining the conference. You'll be invited again next year, all of these, and anytime you can join us, it's great. This is the first time we've had the technology to be able to see everybody who is away, participating virtually, and it's a great pleasure to do that. So thank you all for participating, whether in person or virtually, and have a wonderful evening, and come back next time. And let me also say, that was actually fantastic.